I want to say hello to Professor Cornel West and the great Tricia Rose, whom I did not have the honor to be a colleague of when I was at Brown University before her arrival. I am sure that if Professor Rose were in that department, I and her would have been fantastic friends, and she would have fought for me to stay. There were those who fought for me to stay because I loved Brown, I loved the department, I did not want to go anywhere, but fate had it that I parted company from a university that I fell in love with. It's a great honor to be with both of you.
That is true. You know, I was really struck in both of your comments about this, you know, the rationality, the mind as the ruler, right? Yes. And the drive toward the belief that everything that needs to be captured can be captured rationally. Mm-hmm. And that drive, you know, really creates a hierarchy of different kinds of knowledge and a hierarchy about what kinds of elements of the human soul and being can be valued, you know, in an important way. But when you interviewed Cornel, Professor Kiros, you said, you all talked a bit about this core concept of the love supreme, which would be a Black New World African American combination. I'm sorry, you know, of this element of these two traditions. Can I'm going to invite Cornel and then have you follow up, Professor Kiros, on this, because I think there's something interesting there that's coming right out of what this really terrific conversation book is trying to get to.
May I, Professor Rose, would you give me an opportunity to share with you a short quote from Neil Roberts, precisely on this theme. If you've noticed, what is incredible about this small book is, I don't know about you, Professor Rose, but I have never read forewords and introductions as extensive and as powerful as these two pieces by two giants, Neil Roberts, an emerging young scholar, and of course the great George Yance himself. So may I have the honor of quoting just a short paragraph from Neil Roberts. For West, he says, a love supreme is the ethos that enables us to confront the absurd. A love supreme is the secular, the spiritual, the psychological, and the metaphysical all together. A love supreme beckons us not only to hope, but to be hope. Mm-hmm. Not only to hope, but to be hope. I thought, Professor Rose, that you would like this paragraph, which I think is an extension of the question that you just asked us. Now, back to Cornel.
No, I'm glad you quoted that, and you took the words out of my mouth, my dear brother, in terms of the brilliance, the wisdom, the nuance, the sharpness, and the loving character of both the essay by Brother George. That in his essay is just unbelievable, and the introduction by Brother Neil, his is extraordinary. I think this issue of the continuities and the discontinuities, because you got a love supreme already at work on the African continent, generations before John Coltrane was born, or generations before Sarah Vaughan was born, or Stevie Wonder was born. It's just going to be then, it's this one love that has a variety of different forms and manifestations over time and place, over geography, over social structure, over gender, over class. So that the love supreme was always already in place. Mm-hmm. But the question becomes, what particular concrete manifestations does it take? How is it understood in light of the present historical circumstances and conditions? And so when I talk about love supreme, yes, it does focus on John Coltrane, but he's always a moment in a tradition. He's an instance in a continuum.
Right.
but there's discontinuities as well. You know, the discontinuities are going to be that the New World Africans in the United States, for example, are going to have to come to terms with forms of self-hatred and self-destruction and self-violation and self-flagellation that's very different than those in Ethiopia, for example. I mean, Ethiopians have a certain kind of self-respect, self-confidence that most Black folk in the United States don't have culturally in terms of the relation to their civilization. We've been taught to hate ourselves. That's not to say that some Ethiopians don't hate themselves. Of course, as human beings, they could, but they have access to a rich civilization and culture that they learned from their mothers and fathers and grandmothers and grandfathers that go back thousands of years that we just don't have, owing to the intervention of one of the most barbaric forms of domination called white supremacist slavery that was psychic and spiritual as well as social and economic and political. And so in that sense, you know, we've had to come to terms with Negroosity in the way in which Ethiopians never have.
Right.
There are no Negroes in Ethiopia. You know what I mean? It's just a fact. They're beautiful Black folk, but there ain't no Negro. And we got
Unless a couple of us went over there, Cornel.
Yeah, but that's true. Now we could bring some Negroosity there and help confuse some folk. But that's another
story. That's another show. That's another show.
That's another show. That's right.
No, I think that's incredibly important. Especially this question about the degree to which people who have basically been subjected to this kind of, you know, saturating and, you know, all-encompassing process of dehumanization or attempt to dehumanize. Right, because it's not successful, right? That's but what's amazing about it is its brutality, and what's more amazing about it is the will to resist and transform that, which has been so important. And so one of the things that I think has been a source of resilience in this regard has been this focus on the ability of Black Americans, I'm speaking specifically, but we could be talking about New World Africans in many contexts, to develop enough of a kind of normative critique. That is to say that the standard of critique in the community is normative, and that critique builds a barrier between the self you're attempting to cultivate and the self that white supremacy is attempting to cultivate. It's not pure, it's not perfect, it's not flawless, it has holes in it, everything does, right? But there's something about this notion of a kind of deep education, which you talk a lot about, Cornel, and it's in here in a really interesting way, right? Your idea of paideia as this way of developing a kind of deep critical mind in the face of. Can you say a little bit more about that, Cornel?
Yes.
Yes, I think it's very important as free Black people to never have a fear of any philosophical tradition, wherever it comes from Europe, Africa, indigenous peoples, or what have you. The question is, how do you use it? How do you deploy it? What sets of insights can you gain from it? Mm-hmm. What kind of blindnesses do you try to hold at arm's length? And so when I talk about paideia, that does come directly out of the Greeks. The Greeks themselves are very much influenced by not just the Middle East, but of Northern Africa itself. But that's that deep education we're talking about. That paideia that Socrates enacts, that fearless speech, that plain speech that we see in the Malcolm X, or Fannie Lou Hamer was also talked about in Socrates' day, in terms of what it is to think critically and raise one's voice in that way. And so for me, this notion of paideia is one that's tied to self-respect, self-determination, self-defense, self-affirmation, always within the context of community, building on the best of one's tradition. And so paideia, parrhesia, phronesis, practical wisdom. We get the discourse in Aristotle. He has no monopoly on that. Practical wisdom sits at the center of cultures across the board, Africa, Asia, Latin America, and so forth. The question of what forms of practical wisdom. And then in the modern and late modern period, the question becomes, what does the commodification of the world due to paideia? How does education become reduced to market-driven schooling? What does commodification do to the notion of practical wisdom? So the practical wisdom is reduced to just being smart and getting rich. What does it do to paideia, where it takes tremendous courage, as opposed to too often the cowardly forms of careerism and opportunism that characterize so much of academic life? That's the flattening of paideia. That's the flattening of fearless speech, of plain speech, of unintimidated speech. And so you can get the best of that in Europe, you can get the worst of that in Europe. Right. We talk about this in the book. European crimes, barbaric. European philosophy, some figures are critical of those crimes. Same would be true in Africa. You got African crimes. It's like Asian crimes, indigenous people's crimes, Black crimes, white crimes, whatever it is. But when you're looking at the philosophy, you're looking at those figures and those insights that are critical of those crimes in the name of the best of philosophy, love of wisdom.
Professor Rose, would you give me an opportunity to be democratic and also share with my viewers a passage from George Yancey on this point?
Yes, yeah.
There is a family resemblance between what was just articulated and the way Yancey captured Cornel. Yancey writes, within the dreadful context of Floyd's killing, there was no chaotic moment as white police officer Chauvin purposely pinned his knee on Floyd's neck. There was no suturing, which I argue is a form of vulnerability, a form of being open to be wounded by another's pain, cries, and agony. What West refers to as the ice age of indifference is a species of suturing, of living the lie of invulnerability. West's act of turning a spotlight on such indifference is itself an act of kenosis, as he is able to self-empty in the service of the orphans, the elderly widows, the relatively helpless children, and goes on to embrace poor people, working people, people of color, victims of violence, domestic and international. Furthermore, concluding, this myth-making is in part a form of bad faith and hubris, a mode of obfuscation and forgetfulness, or even willed ignorance of our profound historicity. For me, then, aletheia is important as it denotes the process of unconcealing, of disclosing those monstrous aspects of reality that many of us would rather not see or even acknowledge exist. Aletheia, on my view, presupposes the concept of paideia, or courageous speech, which is what Cornel and you, Professor Rose, do in this particular podcast. Consistent courage, consistent risk-taking, consistent articulation of the interiors of pain, consistent commitment to make those are invisible visible, consistent attempt at passionately, by using an Egyptian term called ma'at, which embodies truth-speaking, compassion, empathy, sincerity, justice, and love, when you're particularly thinking about the so-called Black crime. There is a difference between simply acknowledging a Black crime as it is taking place on the street, and acknowledging it within the context of recognizing the coextensiveness of the depredation of necessary material resources, but people of color do not have, which necessarily lead them to become vulnerable committers of crime. I think these two should be coextensive. We should not separate them so that we can simply speak about Black crime. Professor Rose has written brilliantly about this.
I appreciate that. I appreciate that. I mean, it's a tough, I mean, one of the things that's been great about doing this show with Cornel is that he never loses sight of all of those layers. I always think, okay, where's this sentence going to start? And then where's it going to go? And where's it going to end up? And it's always a different topic, but it's a very consistent commitment to the very layers of circumstance that are so important. Yeah. Cornel, did you want to? Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Please go ahead.
I wouldn't leave without saying this from my heart. I also want to acknowledge the contributions of my brothers and sisters, the African Americans. On his shoulders I stand. Wait not for the civil rights movement. Wait not for the lynchings, the sufferings, and the heroic resistance of African Americans. I, Teodros Kiros, would not be sitting here and philosophizing with my brothers and sisters. We too often forget what C.L.R. James calls the creativity of the masses. In this instance, the creativity of the Black masses. In the heat of these lynchings, in the heat of this abuse, our ancestors fought powerfully and made it possible for us to sit where we're sitting now, which we sometimes forget when we focus on Black crime.
I have to say something here, which I you've inspired me to say, which is that, this indebtedness that we have to ancestors, to relatives, to earlier generations of movements, I think is incredibly important. And I want to just add one dimension specifically to your recall, to your memory about that, and reminding us how important it is. And that is that, there's a lot of pressure, in higher education for Black people, for women, certainly in STEM and hard sort of fields that are considered extremely masculine, economics, philosophy, and so on, that people of color, Black people, women, Indigenous people are rewarded for precisely forgetting that history, right? That is to say, the rewards are about belonging in such a way that you don't really bring anybody with you, so that the institution can accommodate your presence insofar as you take up the categories and the concerns that were going on before you got there. And so, your point is not only that we would all not be sitting here, but that there's an imperative that comes with the opportunity that has been created for us. And that imperative, I think is something obviously Cornel, is brilliant at doing and heartfelt and genuine and clear about, but you yourself also possess this. And I try to embody it the best I can as well.
You embody it in a mighty way, but it's precisely those narrow, truncated, vacuous forms of individualism and careerism and opportunism that don't allow us to have the virtuous acknowledgement of those who came before. So we have a sense of gratitude that's tied to empowerment, gratitude of the past. That's the role of the ancestors. That's the role of the wise ones that we see in African cultures across the board, the griots, the storytellers, those who lay down the various narratives that allow us to acknowledge what actually enabled us. And it's always reciprocal, right? There's no, you think of the inspiration of slave insurrections vis-a-vis what Haiti did in pushing out the French imperialists. You think of Menelik pushing out the Italian imperialists in the 1890s. You think of Haile Selassie standing up against the Italians again in the 1930s. You think of decolonization movements in every corner of the African globe. They are inseparable from the Black freedom struggle in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and 80s here. So it's mutual. We're learning from one another. Same is true in terms of the corruption of the national bourgeoisies in Africa. Once independence sets in, then you got power. Then you've got domination. You forget about the poor. You forget about the rural folk. You forget about the country folk. So it is in the United States. Our Black bourgeoisie gets into power. They forget about the brothers and sisters in the hood. They can have mass incarceration of the brothers and sisters in the hood while they off living large, off in some Martha's Vineyard context or something. See, we have to be consistent intellectually, philosophically, politically, and spiritually. And we learn that from each other. Africans in the continent, New World Africans in New York, Chicago, Boston, Providence, and everything. And yet all of us fall short. I mean, that's the important point. The critique that we put forward, we always have to acknowledge the degree to which we are always already connected to it. So we're critical of ourselves. That kind of self-criticism is crucial for what philosophy is about. And that's why this text talks about philosophy, death, and Chekhov. Philosophy, love, and Coltrane. What has Chekhov got to do with it? Well, he's Russian. Yeah, but he's human too, and he's got a sense of what it is to live in time. And Black folk have always been, Africans have always been a people preoccupied with temporality, what it is to live in time, how you're going to use time and make sure time doesn't use you. And as you deal with vanishing creatures and disappearing persons in time and out of time, what is your relation to them once they're dead? What is relation of those in the coffin and the quick and those still alive? How do you keep alive the best of their tradition? How do you keep alive the afterlife in your own life? That's a question of temporality. That's a question of historicity. And in this text, we got a whole lot of discussion. I'm just following Brother Teodros on this. Whole lot of discussion of individuality, historicity, and democracy in the form of deep self-determination. Not these bourgeois liberal forms of democracy in terms of elites ruling in the name of some truncated gesture toward democracy. Those are the kind of issues that we wrestle with, and all we are, one voice in a caravan of love.
Hey there. Thank you for joining us on The Tightrope. For the full episode, please visit us at www.thetightrope.pod.com. We'll see you soon.